If you want to build your first set of cabinets for the workshop or your home, but you don't even know where to start because you're so confused by all the conflicting information out there, or maybe you're just tired of seeing these DIY videos filmed in workshops bigger than most houses filled with industrial equipment like CNCs. Well, you're in luck because I'm going to teach you how to build your own custom cabinets in a small hobby shop like this one, and it could save you thousands of dollars. And since I know not everyone has the same experience or tools, I'm going to give you 2 to 3 ways to build all the parts, the boxes, the drawers, and the doors with a variety of skills and techniques that I've shown over the years, all in one convenient place. So if you're ready to learn the most essential skill in woodworking, let's get started. I'm here at my local home center. I'm getting the plywood I need for the project, and I'm going to give you a quick recap on exactly what to buy, but let's save that for when we get back to the shop because I find this all incredibly uncomfortable and people are starting to look at me all weird. If you're a non-pickup driving son of a gun like me, you can sympathize that a 4x8 sheet of plywood does not fit in my car, which means I need this broken down by my new friend Raheem. And I'm not asking Raheem to cut all the parts out, just one rip so I can actually get it home. And if your store's panel saw has been out of commission for 18 months, like that ice cream machine at McDonald's that's never working, bring your own tools and be that weird guy in a parking lot. Tailgate broke. 2x4 for the win. Okay, I've got my pieces back home, and this is really where you need to slow down, especially if you're making multiple cabinets with different dimensions. But here's a great rule of thumb. Using a circular saw and an edge guide to cut the parts for my cabinet sides and bottom. Now, if I leave the edge guide locked into place, this will ensure that my parts have the exact same depth. This is also why I find programs like Cutlass Optimizer not terribly reliable, because they don't account for how sheet goods are truly broken down. And while you maximize the yield, it introduces too many opportunities for human error, in my opinion. And if you're one of those people that's thinking out loud, I don't have one of those edge guides, well, get creative and use a straight edge or eat out one less time next month and save up because this is only $45. I can only do so much, people. I know this doesn't quite look like cabinet parts yet, but stay with me. Now, just because the sides are parallel to one another, it doesn't actually mean that the ends are 90 degrees to the side. And if they're not, you end up building a parallelogram instead of a box. I'm actually not entirely sure that's the right use of parallelogram. Is it? We're going to go with that. But this is one of the most important cuts of the entire project because it will be our reference to establish all other cross cuts. So use a nice square that you know is accurate and take time lining this puppy up. Now, that cut done, you normally would place these up against the fence of your table saw and you would cut the opposing side to its final width. And if you don't have a table saw, well, let's just say that this video is a great excuse to convince your significant other that you need one. However, for the interim, clamp the 2 side parts together and then cut them to their final dimension at the same time so they perfectly match. If you're following along at home, great news because you now have 2 perfectly square cabinet sides, which means it's time to focus on the bottoms and top stretchers. Now that dimension is going to be completely dependent on your final cabinet width, so dealer's choice. However, it is mandatory to cut the parts at the same time, so they will be identical. And I'll be using the miter saw and a stop block to get this done safely. Before I get too far ahead of myself though, let's talk about plywood. For simplicity's sake, I'm going to break this into 2 main categories. First, you have construction grade products like OSB or sheathing, which is only passable for exterior walls or subfloors, not really suitable for what we do. The second category are cabinet grade offerings, and this is a bit like asking which bear is best. However, here's a good rule of thumb. If you're making something out in the shop, the cheap radiata pine or sanded plywood is more than adequate. For a finished look inside your home, get a decent birch, maple, or oak veneer. Here locally, that's sold by Columbia Forest or Pure Bond. It might be different in your area. Now, if you're looking to splurge, you can buy Baltic birch from a specialty dealer, which has more ply layers, and this helps it stay flatter and stronger for driving in screws. But it does cost about 50 to 60% more than standard plywood. Again, not necessary. We now have the starting point for your typical IKEA cabinet. We've got the sides, stretcher, and the bottom, but you might be thinking, come on IKEA, what about the backs? Well, not so fast, my friend, because I'm actually building cabinets for the shop and then my house in tandem, I've got the opportunity to show you a couple different options for attaching the backs, a more traditional version and then something more DIY friendly. Now we're going to start with the more traditional because that does require some prep before assembly. The side pieces of my laundry room cabinet are going to get a groove along the inside of the entire height of the piece. And the trick to getting that groove in the correct spot is to use your back stretchers to set the fence distance. And then I like to raise my blade to 1/4 of an inch using a 1/4 of an inch drill bit for reference. Then you can take a couple passes bumping the fence away from the blade each time. Just make sure you're using a scrap piece to test the fit. The goal is to cut a groove that's just a smidgen wider than whatever plywood you're using for this back panel. I'll cover the more DIY version and explain the pros and cons of each after I put these pieces together. I find the assembly of cabinet boxes is where a lot of the controversy seems to rear its ugly internet head. For instance, you've got the overcompensating dados and glue in one corner, and then the other, you have the Pinterest pocket hole princes and princesses. And then you've got people like myself that say, it depends. For instance, this set of cabinets is going in my laundry room, and the sides will not be exposed. They'll be screwed to one another and to the studs in the wall, which means they won't be racking back and forth. Also, how much stress do you really put on a cabinet when opening a door? It's not much. And that's a normal day in the life of these boxes. So all I'm going to be using is a standard 1 3/4 inch screw to fasten the parts together. There's no need to waste time with pocket holes or glue. It's just simply overkill. Conversely, this lovely specimen of a shop cabinet is going to hold a pretty heavy tool. It's going to be wheeled around, won't be attached to anything, and has exposed sides. So all of that adds up to pocket screws plus glue. So when you see someone spouting off about the correct way to do something without ever acknowledging the application, you have my permission to tell them shoo-shoo. As far as the placement of these pocket holes, try and space them out as evenly as you can, but don't beat yourself up trying to make them perfect. It really doesn't matter too much. When I'm assembling cabinet cases with pocket screws and glue, I do like to use brad nails as an extra set of hands. Essentially, the brad nails hold the pieces together and keep them steady while driving in the screws. While it will likely add a little bit of extra time to the process, it should save you from building out of square boxes. Speaking of, moment of truth. Suck it, haters. A big thank you to all my DIY enthusiasts for being patient, but now we can finally attach the back panel. If your cabinet has exposed sides like this one, you likely don't want to see the edge grain of your plywood. A couple quick passes with a rabbiting bit and your trim router will do the trick though. I like to set mine to about 1/8 of an inch deeper than my back panel thickness, and a little router hack to safely use your tool is to make an L with your right hand and then put your thumb against the edge you will be cutting, and whatever way your finger is pointing is your feed direction. Now it's as simple as measuring your opening and cutting the panel to size. I'm also using 1/4 inch plywood for this. Now you might be thinking, do I need 1/2 inch or 3/4? But the extra thickness just isn't necessary. All you're looking for is something to keep the box from racking back and forth. The router does leave round corners, which means you either square them off with a chisel, but ew, hand tools are gross, so I opt for rounding the back panel edges with a jigsaw. Time to see if it actually fits. Now, I did cut this about 1/32 of an inch shorter in both directions because it doesn't need to be super snug. Just want it to rest in your rabbet. Let's see how we did. Oh yeah, that'll be really good. Can glue that down later. Something else to note, if you're not worried about the exposed edges or you're not going to see the size of your cabinet, you don't need to recess this at all. Just take a 1/4 inch piece of plywood and tack it on the back and go about your day. If you're starting to doze off, how about a little controversy to wake you back up? Because it's time to stoke the proverbial grumpy woodworker flames by talking toe kicks. Now you have two options here, and the first is an integrated toe kick, which means you're going to cut notches into the side pieces of your cabinets before assembly. Now the second method, which is my preferred and the one I'll be demonstrating, is an entirely separate toe kick. I'll start by using the edge guide to rip 4-inch strips from my remaining 3/4 inch plywood, while my table saw gives me dirty looks that it's not getting any attention. The front and back stretchers need to be the exact same width of my finished cabinet, which is as simple as transferring that measurement to the miter saw and taking a couple chops. A general rule of thumb for the toe kick depth is 3 inches less than the total depth of the cabinet. And don't forget to account for the thickness of your front and back stretchers. If you tend to be math averse like me, 2 offcuts will save you from accidentally getting that measurement wrong. I'm also cutting 3 extra pieces that are the same length, and I'll show you why momentarily. To save myself from having to fill screw holes before this is painted, I'm opting to use concealed pocket screws for the main assembly of the toe kick, and this is the exact same procedure as making our boxes. The one difference are these extra pieces, and the idea is once you secure these to the side and the middle, it gives you something to screw the cabinet into the toe kick without trying to hit this edge. And if you're making a toe kick that has multiple cabinets on it, place the middle supports where those cabinets meet. And once we're done building the cabinets, I'll show you how simple it is to level these in place. Every good box needs a good front, and you have 2 choices here. Although as I'm saying this out loud, I'm now realizing this video is starting to sound like a crappy game show behind door number 1, behind door number 2. I don't know, I like giving you guys options. Let me know what you think of this format overall. Moving on. If you're new to cabinet making, option 1 is called frameless, and it looks just like this. The only difference is you would apply an edge banding before you assembled all these parts together to hide the ugly plywood edges. I personally prefer to use frameless when I'm building solid wood furniture because I think it looks a little more modern and nice and neat. However, for this style of build, I prefer option 2, which is called a face frame, and it's something you typically see in your own kitchen cabinets. The good news is this is super easy and you can buy ready-made strips from your local home center. I'm using 6-foot Select Pine 1x2s, which are only $5 a piece and have no knots in them unlike the common board. And if you spend a little bit of time looking for the straight ones, I think these are a heck of a deal. You saw me measuring and cutting the 2 vertical pieces. Snobby woodworking lingo requires you refer to them as stiles. And I like to clamp my stiles to the box with the edges flush with the cabinet sides. Then I can create a referential measurement and sneak up on the fit for the horizontal pieces that are known as rails. So remember, if you want to be taken seriously at a woodworking store, upon arrival, walk in and shout, "Show me your rails and stiles!" Everyone will love it, I promise. I've seen people use dowels for face frame construction, but again, simple pocket holes and a little glue is more than strong enough in this application, and it's quick and easy. Just make sure you're finding a way to clamp the parts down during assembly because, as I mentioned, the one downside to these entry-level pocket holes is they do like to go for a walk when driving in screws. I have my face frame almost done, but I do want to add another rail that's going to separate the top drawer from the bottom door. Now, instead of measuring this, all you have to do is cut a couple spacer blocks that are the same size, and you can shove it up against, and everything will be dead square. This is a great tip for removing human error and something you should try to incorporate into your workflow whenever possible. All right, we now have a perfectly square face frame. And if you want to double check that, simple little trick is to take a tape measure and you can measure the diagonals from one corner to the next and then make sure it matches on the other side. And we are in good shape here. And the good news is, even if your cabinet box is a little out of square, a nice square face frame can help hide it. If your cabinet does not have exposed sides, pocket holes driven in from the side is a great way for attaching the face frame. However, I don't have that luxury on this piece, so I'm going to use glue and clamps. If you're feeling impatient or you're painting, use some brad nails right through the front and you can fill them later. Also, if you're painting the cabinets, they sell these pre-primed 1x2s that also work great for face frames and are even cheaper than the Select Pine. All right, for everybody that's following along, congrats. You are now the owner and operator of a non-lucrative and highly inefficient garage cabinet shop. A face frame like this will leave a lip on the inside of the cabinet, so I'm screwing in a couple spacer pieces and then future John can install the slides on those spacers, and that way the drawer can clear the lip and function properly. Now is a very appropriate time to attach the back panels, and as promised, I want to point out the differences between these 2 styles. With the more advanced traditional version, these stretchers in the back double as nailers, meaning something to screw the cabinets to the wall, and they are completely hidden, so it looks pretty professional after it's all put together. You can of course add nailer strips to this DIY version, but the downside is they will be visible from inside your cabinet when you open the door. Not the end of the world, but if it's for something like your kitchen, not the best look. As a workaround, instead of a 1/4 inch plywood for the back panel, you could inset 1/2 inch, and that will give you more than enough bite to act as a nailer. So pick an option based on your own situation and budget, but now I can show you how simple it is to level these toe kicks. Welcome to our pantry laundry room combo. I'm going to be adding 2 cabinets next to this one that's already existing. It's from Home Depot. Don't tell anyone. With my toe kick in the right spot, I can use these handy shims to get the platform perfectly level in all directions, and any spot that needs to be propped up gets a piece of scrap plywood and then some screws. When you're setting multiple cabinets, this is so much easier than trying to shim each one and get them perfectly level with their brothers and sisters. And all that's left to do is screw them down into those toe kicks, making sure you're hitting the horizontal stretchers. So there you go, simple cabinet boxes that will be a much higher quality than anything you can buy from a store without breaking the bank. Time to bust some myths and go over how to build drawers while likely upsetting the internet know-it-alls. Our first option will be a very simple down and dirty drawer. You might even need to shower after, but these are perfect if you're just starting out, especially for shop projects. Now, as the complexity of each design progresses, so will the tools, but to keep this beginner option as simple as possible, we will mostly use the circular saw, which is what I'm currently using to rip the piece from this glorious 1/2 inch Home Depot plywood that will make the sides in the front. A guide like this or a straight edge works swimmingly. And general drawer box making rules call for a 1/2 inch to 1 inch of clearance on the top and the bottom. I prefer a little extra room, so I always lean closer to 1 inch. With our strip ripped down to the proper height, it's time to cross-cut parts for the sides and the front and the back from this board. Now, the length of your sides will be determined by a couple different factors: the depth of the cabinet and the length of the slides that you're using. Slides are typically sold in 2-inch increments that are between 10 and 28 inches long. So let's say you have an 18-inch deep cabinet. I would drop down to the 16-inch slides, but for the actual length of the box, I do like to give myself a little bit of wiggle room. So let's add 1/4 inch and say that our side length will be 16 1/4 inches. Without a doubt, the Achilles heel of a circular saw is making repeatable cuts. However, the easiest way to fix your torn Achilles is with a simple crosscut sled like this one. By setting up stop blocks, you remove the biggest variable from the equation, measuring, aka human error. Good news for you, if you want to build your own, I created a set of plans and there's a link in the description below. No more excuses. Now, our down and dirty drawer width is also going to be determined by a couple different factors. The first being the actual width of your box opening, and the second, and I know this is boring, but the instructions that come with your slides. Now, in keeping with the theme of this first drawer option, I'm using the cheapest possible option that I could find that I have experience with. These call for subtracting 1 inch from your total width. However, because I'm a boring middle-aged father of 2, I don't like to live dangerously. So I'm again erring on the side of caution and giving myself a tiny bit of wiggle room when I'm setting up my stop block. So rather than subtracting the 1 inch, it's more like 1 inch in a 32nd, so the drawer doesn't bind. Additionally, I'm using 2 offcuts of plywood to account for the thickness of the 2 sides. And if you forgot to subtract that, you're gonna have a bad time. If you feel obligated to sand your drawers, I would do that now, because we all know that your friends will be verifying the smoothness of your drawers whenever they come over to use a tool. Excellent, we now have sides, a front and a back for our box. It's time to smush them all together though and break the rules, which will surely fire up the comments section. I like to start by applying a layer of glue to the end grain of the fronts and the backs, and I find it's best to let this soak in for a couple minutes or so. Then you come back and apply a thin bead of glue along the outside edge. So a couple things are going on here. That first layer of glue is going to absorb into the end grain, and then the second one will sit more on the surface so it can do some actual holding. If you apply along the inside, the glue will squeeze out, and then you've got a mess to clean up on the inside corners. Speaking of, I'm shooting 1 inch brads that are 18 gauge into the sides of these. And all they do is hold everything nice and snug while the glue dries, because the brads are actually quite weak, like me, and really do nothing in the grand scheme of things. That's where the glue comes in, and the bottom, which you will see shortly. Now, a lot of curmudgeons will tell you that this drawer will break, blah, 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 that is cheap, and it's a lazy way to do it. Thankfully, not everything needs to be made to withstand the blunt force trauma of an elephant. And yes, it's possible that these might weaken 45 years from now, but I don't expect shop drawers to live that long. I've made a lot, I mean a lot of drawers like this, and never had one fail. And it's likely exactly what you have in your own kitchen. Quick brad nail tip to help you prevent blowout. Brads are designed to deflect side to side. If you hold your brad nailer in this orientation instead of perpendicular like this, you do run the risk of the brad deflecting and then shooting out the side of your workpiece. And I made that mistake so many times for a number of years until I finally figured that out. Now, if the grumps weren't worked up enough from that, this next step will surely do it, and that is attaching the bottom. I'm just verifying my measurements here before I cut the panel. This is also a good time to see how square your box actually is by measuring the diagonals. Then we can go back to the circular saw to cut out a piece of 1/4-inch plywood to match those exact measurements. And the worst case scenario here is you want to be a smidgen oversized, and then you can sand it down or use a router to make it match later on. Just be sure that you don't cut it too small. We are ready to go. I'm not going to tell you that it's perfect because it's not, and that's the reality when you're working with more basic tools like a circular saw and you don't have a crosscut sled on a table saw or a miter saw, but it's okay, we can fix it. It's not the end of the world. Don't beat yourself up. I'm going to attach this the exact same way that I did everything else, using a little bit of glue and then some brad nails. I've shown making drawers like this before, and like I said, people freak out, like Frank, who claims it's junk and it can only hold toothpicks. Junk? That's hurtful, Frank. But admittedly, somewhat true. What's not true is strength. Is it as strong as other drawer bottoms we will build later? No, but it's more than strong enough for most use cases in a shop. Example, I built these drawers 8 years ago and I abused them. They hold a lot of heavy tools without flinching. My miter saw station built the exact same way, no issues. People like Frank are the definition of internet gatekeepers and why beginners feel so overwhelmed. Ignore them, just build stuff, and if it breaks, you fix it. You could leave this exactly as is. I would take a sander or some sandpaper and break the edges along the top and then also the bottom. Now, speaking of the bottom, you are going to see the exposed end grain of the plywood all along here. It's not a big deal, especially if this is just for shop projects, but if you do want to somewhat hide it, use either a block plane or a router with a chamfer bit, and that will disguise your ugly plywood edge along the bottom. Now, keep in mind, this is purely aesthetic and has nothing to do with the performance of the drawer. All right, now that is looking good. The funny thing is, if you use these really cheap drawer slides, they actually hide that entire bottom edge, so not really important, but if you use different slides, it's a neat trick. A couple additional things to clarify while we do this final install. As I said, I'm using 1/2-inch material here. I do like to use 5/8 of an inch, but that's generally only available at specialty lumber stores, and 3/4 of an inch is quite frankly overkill and too heavy. If you want the extra peace of mind, swap the 1/4 inch for the 1/2 inch on the bottom. If possible, lay your cabinet on its side while you're installing the slides. It's much easier than fighting gravity. Another trick to getting the slides at the same height is to use scrap pieces of wood as spacers. The downside to these El Cheapo ones is that there just isn't much adjustability, so what you save in money, you most certainly give back with installation time. Additionally, these are not full extension slides. If you don't know what that means, you're about to see. The drawer doesn't come out all the way, so it can cut you off from reaching things in the back of the drawer, and it is a bit of a pain for larger items, but it's not the end of the world. All in all, pretty basic, pretty simple. On to the next. All right, our second drawer is one of my favorites, and I'm going to show you a neat trick for dressing them up, which makes these perfect for kitchens, bathrooms, basically anywhere you need a nicer looking drawer. Like I said earlier, as we progress throughout the video, so will the tools we use, which means I have officially declared the table saw to be fair game. And that makes me happy because ripping the strips that will form the drawer is much easier on this bad boy. Now I'm fresh out of 5/8 of an inch plywood, so some basic 3/4 inch birch plywood is being used instead. The calculations for sizing all the parts is the same as the first option. If you skip that, well, shame on you. That wasn't very nice. And the shop supervisors are now mad at you. Before I cut the front, back, and sides from these parts here, it's a good time to dress up the ugly exposed plywood edges. There are a bunch of different ways to apply edge banding. I found this works best for me. It's a simple iron that you run back and forth across, and that activates the glue. And once it cools down, it's locked in place. And just be sure to slightly angle the iron along the sides to get a good stick there. You let it cool down for a bit, and then use a trimmer like this or a chisel to flush up the sides. The nice thing about doing it this way is that you end up spending less time trimming the ends because those are taken care of when the parts are cross-cut to size. Just make sure your edge banding is facing out and not up against the fence, and this will prevent it from tearing out. Oops. And just like the first drawer box, I'm using offcuts from the plywood to perfectly size the front and back without having to do any math. The bottom of the first drawer was simply glued in place. It's effective, but crude. For this option, we're going to class it up a little bit more, dare I say, pinky raising. Now the idea is we're going to cut a groove into the sides and the front. We'll talk more about the back later, but that groove will accept the 1/4 inch plywood that acts as the bottom. The first step is setting your blade height, and since this is 3/4 of an inch material, let's go with just barely shy of a 1/2 inch to keep the math simple later. Then I set the fence to a 1/2 inch, and it's time to get to cutting. Now always use a scrap piece of wood as a test piece to make sure everything is dialed in as it should be. And this is another instance where you get pizza instead of French fry and then you have a bad time. Another fair question is, why don't you run the big long strip through before cross-cutting the parts? You certainly can. However, I found when working with box store potato chip plywood, it's not the flattest and it's easier to work with the short pieces, keeping them snug on the bed of the saw. Once you've made all the passes, simply bump the fence away, the idea being we are making a perfectly sized groove to accept the plywood. Just test the fit on your scrap piece before making the final pass on the actual parts. And you're going for a Goldilocks and the 3 bears, not too tight or loose, just right. But maybe err on the side of a little loose, just in case. And then you can make your final passes on your actual drawer parts. Easy peasy. Okay, now we can talk about this back piece, and it's pretty simple. All we're going to do is raise the blade up, make a through cut, and that's all there is to it. You'll see shortly why this is so helpful. Now you might be thinking the next step is to cut the bottom panel to size. However, that's not how I like to do it. I prefer to assemble everything together first, and to do that, me and the shop supervisors who just got a beach haircut yesterday will be using pocket holes. This is another one of those times you don't need to listen to the grumps, like our friend here, because despite what they tell you, this is a perfect application and you're not a dweeb or a nerd or a loser if you use pocket holes. All right, I might be a dweeb and a nerd, but not so much a loser. The trick with drilling these pocket holes is to pay attention to the location of the bottom groove so you don't drill right through it. And the other trick to assembling these is holding everything together. Because these screws are at an angle, they like to misalign the pieces while you're driving them in. So I use CA glue with an activator spray, which helps it dry instantly. And that essentially acts as a really good set of clamps while you're setting the screws in place to keep it all square. Well, as square as I deserve. I need to explain a couple things right now before you get terribly confused. The drawer is upside down. This is the bottom groove here that will accept the 1/4 inch plywood. Now when we cut this back piece, if you remember, we raised the blade when we were done cutting the grooves. You can see it perfectly lines up with the top of the groove there, which is exactly what we want. And that will allow us to slide the back panel in later, and it has some other awesome benefits that you will see shortly. Now as far as strength, a little bit of wood glue plus screws will make these unbelievably strong. And because the screws are only visible on the back side that you never see, and the front, which is covered by a drawer face, no one will ever know. Now that there are 4 sides to our drawer, we can measure these internal dimensions, and that will size the bottom panel. To figure out the width, I'll measure this inside dimension and then add 1 inch to account for the 1/2 inch deep groove on both sides. But I don't want it to be perfectly snug, so I'm going to subtract about 1/8 of an inch, which will give me plenty of room side to side in case this isn't perfectly square, which it likely is not. And it's the same idea with the length, except adding a 1/2 inch to account for the front groove. Now you might be saying, John, you could easily figure all that out before assembly, and you're not wrong. I've just found doing it this way seems to severely decrease the odds I make a mistake with all the numbers floating around. But you do you, honey boo boo. Okay, let's do a quick test fit, and as promised, I want to discuss the main benefit for constructing drawers this way, particularly the back panel being shorter. Now, a lot of folks online will tell you the main advantage to that is this bottom panel is removable after you're done building, because you would just screw it into place here instead of tacking it and gluing it in. While yes, that is true, if your drawer bottom breaks, you can then fix it. But I can't tell you I've ever had a drawer bottom break. I mean, plywood is a pretty durable material. The only times I've had issues, or rather seen issues with drawer bottoms, is really, really old ones that are made of solid wood, not modern construction like this. So in theory, it's great. In practical application, not really something that's going to happen to you. Where this is a major benefit is the finishing, because now that I know it fits, I've got easy access to all these faces. You sand them before, and now it's super easy to apply finish because you can access both sides. That's the same thing with the bottom panel. You take it out, apply your finish, and then slide it all in for your final assembly. If finishing has been something you dread, you're not alone, because I've received hundreds, well, actually thousands of questions from people who don't know where to start or made an awful mistake. So I recently released a course called Honest Finishing. It's over 4.5 hours of incredible content. The reviews have been amazing so far. There's a link down below and on the screen if you're interested. And thanks for checking it out, or not checking it out, but just thanks for being here. Some people like to debate where you should place full extension drawer slides like these on the box. Many insist on the bottom, others in the middle, so the drawer torques less when it's opening. With something as short as this, meaning the sides aren't high, I'm not sure that it matters much, or at least in my experience, it hasn't. So do whatever makes your heart soar. It is always easier to screw in the slides with the cabinet on its side if possible, and use those spacer blocks. Also, this is why you work top down. It's the same pieces of scrap wood, just cut shorter. All right, time for a test fit on this drawer. And one of the nice things about these slides, while yes, they do cost about 2 times as much as these, is they are a little bit more adjustable. Also, they're full extension, so you can reach things on the back of the drawer, unlike the ones above. Also, if you're willing to pay slightly more money, these do come in soft close options, which is all classe, but not nearly as classe as our next drawer. Our first couple of day class A drawers used plywood, but if you're looking to build something nicer, let's say a custom piece of furniture, and you want to spend more money and do something that only you, the woodworker, will notice and appreciate, well, it's time to step up to hardwood construction. Earlier today, I milled up the finest maple and walnut, which will serve as my drawer parts. Like I said, more advanced methods will require more tools to get it done efficiently. Keyword being efficient. If you were paying attention for drawer number 1 when I explained the sizing, you remember I said that you want to be somewhere between 1/2 inch to 1 inch in between the drawers. If you have a tall cabinet like this with multiple drawers, simply add up the total number of gaps, subtract that from the internal height of the cabinet, and then divide by the number of drawers. And that will tell you how tall to make each one. Easy peasy. The maple will make up our sides, and then the walnut the fronts and the backs. However, we need a way to join these two together. If you were a very talented craftsman and you had way too much time on your hand, you would likely opt for the infamous dovetail joint. They are incredible looking, super strong, and drawers really are the perfect application for them. However, the truth about dovetails is that these were very practical when glue was much weaker, because it was made from the dead horse that you and your family rode back and forth into town when it was time to trade for supplies. But I drive a car and Amazon delivers the same day, so we're going for something that also has a cool aesthetic, is more than strong enough, plus it's much faster and easier to execute. Pinned rabbets. With our first 2 drawer styles, when cutting the front and the back to width, we needed to account for the thickness of the sides. But with rabbets, you don't need to do that. The outer edge of the front and back is flush with the sides. Just be sure to follow the drawer slide instructions on how wide to make the box. I want to make these super classe A, so I'll be using undermounts. If you're using 5/8 of an inch material, like I am, you make your drawer 3/8 of an inch more narrow than the cabinet opening. And for 1/2 inch thickness material, make it 5/8 of an inch more narrow. Just like the second drawer, I am going to cut a groove in the sides and the front for the plywood bottom using a standard table saw blade. Just be sure to test with a scrap piece of wood. And once you're good there, raise the table saw blade all the way up and make your through cut for the back piece. I'm going to use a dado stack to cut the rabbets on the ends of my front and back pieces. Sadly, I'm only making one drawer, so I'm likely going to spend more time getting this set up than actually cutting, but if you're making multiple drawers, this is absolutely the way to go. You want to use a combination of blades and chippers that make the dado stack slightly wider than the width of your material because part of the blade will be buried in the sacrificial fence. There really isn't a hard and fast rule for the depth of a rabbet cut. In an instance like this, I prefer to cut a little deeper than normal, and you'll see why shortly. So I'm marking my desired height on the fence, which makes it super easy momentarily when I'm raising the blade up. To get the fence set to the appropriate distance, I simply take my material and align it with the outer edge of my zero clearance insert, bada bing, bada boom. Raise the blade up until you hit your line and you're ready to go. Well, double check with a scrap piece first. I wanted the blade slightly higher for a deeper cut, so I raised it up and then started working on the actual project parts. If you don't have a dado stack, the same thing can be done with a standard flat top single blade and a significant amount of patience. But my understanding is that we all watch these videos, so we then have the perfect excuse to justify purchases to our significant others. So you're welcome for that. If he or she starts to become irate, explain to them that spending $100 now will definitely save you money in the long run. I take that back. That's probably not true at all. Definitely a lie. Just pay cash and burn the receipt. Before gluing all this together, we do need to do a little bit of prep work to make our lives much easier. First up is marking out the locations where our pins will go. Sometimes I use 3, other times, like today, I'm going to use 2. The most important thing is that they are dead center on the rabbet. Then I'm going to use a 1/4 inch drill bit in my drill press to start the pilot holes. Now I'm not going all the way through, just enough that these can act as a guide later. And if you don't have a drill press, the same thing can be done very carefully with a drill. But again, great excuse, cough cough, for your significant other to make a purchase. Then I'm going to sand all the inside faces and tape off the rabbets so I don't have to deal with any glue squeeze out on the inside corners later. There really aren't any major tricks for gluing all this together. The most important thing is that you do a dry fit before. This will give you a chance to get all of your clamps together and make sure everything is aligning as it should. And in a shocking turn of events, which rarely happens, everything was good for me. Forgot to tape off the inside corners on these sides. So dumb. Now, it shouldn't take anything more than light pressure here. Contrary to what you might have heard on the internet though, rabbets are good but not perfect at self-squaring. Clamping pressure can really manipulate these into weird angles. If you're new to all of this and have limited experience gluing things together, it might be worth investing in some corner clamps. They are especially handy with much larger glue-ups, unlike this one. There is another method called the quarter method for building drawers that is somewhat similar to this, but I think you'll see shortly why I prefer the look of the contrasting pins. It's just more interesting. You want to let these dry for at least a couple hours, but now we can add our modern day flair while simultaneously reinforcing the joint. Additionally, notice how clean these inside corners are. It's worth taking the extra time to tape them, no cleanup afterwards. After setting the flag stop on the same 1/4 inch drill bit, I can drill all the way through into the front and the backs. For years, I would use screws and then hide them with a wood plug, but recently, after realizing that that was way too slow, and the screws do occasionally cause problems splitting the wood, I've converted to dowels. I simply taper the end of the 1/4 inch dowel, drop in some wood glue, tap, tap, tap a row into place, and then flush trim off the excess. So much faster, and a lot less can go wrong. Now, the rabbets would likely be plenty strong on their own, but pinning them in this direction ensures this drawer will last a very, very long time. Because of their orientation, you're never pulling against the pins. Not exactly like the fancy pants dovetail joint, but the same general idea. Also, for the confused foreign friends, calling it a rebate is just as silly as it sharing the name with a fluffy bunny. Regardless if you name your joint after an animal or the money you get back from buying a washer and dryer, you still need to put a bottom on your drawer, and I'm going to do that the same way I did option number 2. Now, I hope one of the things that you take away from this video is that you can mix and match elements of each drawer construction style with others to build something that works for you. And the same thing goes for the slides. Each project has different requirements, so don't get turned off when you see workbenches on YouTube with $500 worth of drawer slides and hardware. I did say it's good to mix and match construction styles If you're going to be using the undermounts, make sure your back is shorter like I did with option 2 and 3 here. So that should be your go-to, because otherwise a full height back interferes with the slides underneath, and then you need to cut out notches, which is an absolute pain. There is a tiny little trick when you're installing undermount slides. The idea is the back part of the slide will eventually need to be flush with the back of the drawer, but there's a pin that prevents that from happening. So that pin needs to be recessed into the back piece. And there's a couple ways you can do this. You can buy a jig for $40 or place the slides on the bottom of the drawer, tap a mallet on the back, and that will locate the exact spot. Then drill those out. Just be sure to set a flag so you don't go all the way through your back panel, which I have done more times than I care to admit. And to make it more complicated, the smaller pin is around 3/32 of an inch and the larger is 1/4 of an inch. Now, if you've never worked with undermount slides, number one, be prepared for some sticker shock. But there are some additional items of note. Unlike the cheaper side mount that are sold in 2-inch sizes, these come in increments of 3 inches, 12, 15, 18, 21, etc. These are 15. Now, the benefit of paying more is that they offer a crazy amount of adjustability after you've installed it to get everything aligned perfectly. And they are so buttery smooth. Plus, they are completely hidden, so you get to show off your super cool looking sides. Are they as nice as dovetails? That's up for debate, but sign me up for something that takes a fraction of the time, is just as strong, and I don't need to kill the family horse to do it. It's a joke, people, lighten up. Excellent job making your drawers. Let's make some door and drawer fronts to cover up all that hard work. For our basic beginner door, all you're going to need is a circular saw, sander, some clamps, a square, and some DIY grit and determination. We're making a shaker style because I like to fit in. So head to your local home center and buy some 1/2-inch and 1/4-inch MDF. They come in full sheets or these nice smaller panels that are much easier to deal with. Also, if you're going to be storing these panels for any length of time, even if it's overnight, keep them laying flat on something that's actually flat, because like me, they're very frail and can barely support their own body weight when standing up. Now, if you don't have space for all this, you can lean it against the wall, but make sure you're doing that on the long edge, not the top or the bottom. Otherwise, these things will warp on you pretty quickly. Since I'm doing an overlay style door, it's as simple as measuring in both directions, taking the width and then the height, and adding an inch, and that will give me a 1/2-inch overlay all the way around. The thicker 1/2-inch MDF will be my base piece, which means it needs to be cut to the appropriate size. Now, factory edges on MDF, especially those from a home center, have generally been through a war, so it's best to remove that first. And notice I'm using the 1/4-inch piece as a guide rail to keep the cut nice and straight. After a quick rehab session, we're left with a crisp edge, and just to be sure, make sure you mark it so you don't lose track of everything. Before you remove the makeshift fence, you want to make sure that you measure this distance right here, because that's the offset of the base plate to the edge of your saw blade. And mine is 3 9/16. So I can take that and add it to the final width of the cabinet door, which was 15 1/16, and that gives me 18 10/16, which is I think 18 5/8. Also, save it metric people. We get it. This is ridiculous. We put a man on the moon, okay? Doesn't matter if we use metric to do it. We put a man on the moon. All right, so I can measure and mark from both ends of that 1/2-inch sheet and then align the 1/4-inch panel, aka our de facto fence, and get to cutting. I like to use these foam insulation boards to protect my workbench and then give me something to cut into. It also raises the workpiece up so I can get the clamps underneath. And be sure to keep your eyes on the fence, not the blade, to ensure the saw doesn't wander away. If I were making multiple doors that were the same size, instead of cutting the shorter width here, I would have cut along the length so I could get a BOGO deal with 2 or 3 additional panels instead of just 1. Anyways, this has 2 parallel edges, but the ends are not square. To remedy that situation, I'll first establish a new cut using a square to make everything nice at 90 degrees. And you do want to take some extra time here double checking your setup. Now, we're going to talk all about tools throughout this video, but you can build most things with a circular saw. It just takes longer. Hence why you see us using other tools in videos. We like to move fast, but don't let tools be an excuse for not getting something done. So I'm then measuring the opposing side and making another cut, which establishes the final height. But congratulations, you now have a bunch of smushed up sawdust mixed with glue in a randomly sized rectangle. Give yourself a nice pat on the back. Before going forward, it is good practice to double check that your base piece is the appropriate size and will fit into the cabinet. Not that I would ever cut anything too big or small. I also like to take a look at the diagonals, and what this does is ensure that your piece is square, and these two measurements should be nearly identical. If they're within a 1/16 of an inch, you're totally fine. Anything more and I would go back and recut it. This is looking good, which means we can cut some thin strips out of the 1/4 inch MDF behind me to act as our faux rails and stiles. Rails and stiles are generally between 2 to 2.5 inches wide. Anything more than that and you're just Cybertruck overcompensating. Mine are going to be 2 inches to match some existing doors. To make the cut, I'm using this rip guide that attaches to a circular saw. I'm not going to tell you that it's perfect. In fact, I think the straight edge trick that I was showing is more accurate, but I'm all about giving you different ways to get it done. If you're new to all this and you want to fit in with the cool kids lingo, stiles are the vertical pieces on a door and then rails are the horizontal. I'm going to start with getting my stiles to their finished size, which is just the height of the door. I'm doing these at the same time, also known as batch cutting, and I'm employing the help of this crosscut sled that I made for my circular saw. Now, you don't need one of these, but I'm finding it super helpful for operations like this. Good news for you, if you want to build your own, I created a set of plans and there's a link in the description below. Look, I'm doing my best here, people, trying to help out. However, I'm sure someone will still complain that a circular saw with plans is not beginner DIY. And to that, I say GFY. Nonetheless, with the stiles temporarily in place, I can measure that opening for my rails and set up a stop block on the crosscut sled to cut them to size. This was just barely too long after my first cut and needed a second trim of about a 32nd of an inch. For situations like this, I find these plastic handy shims are perfect and they come in color-coded nominal dimensions. But that fits just right. And now the most important part, gluing these into place. But before I do that, I'm going to draw a line all the way around the perimeter of my piece, and that's to serve as a Gandalf thou shalt not pass mark while I'm actually spreading the glue around. A little Lord of the Rings reference for the kids at home. Now, MDF is like a sponge because it's, well, a bunch of compressed sawdust, so don't be stingy with the glue. A bit of tape and then a board over the top with some weights will be more than enough to hold it in place while the glue dries, or you can pop some brad nails in and then cover those up with wood filler. If you're just doing the weights after an hour or so, it's more than dry enough, so don't bother waiting until the next day if you want to keep on moving. A general rule of thumb when you're prepping something for finish, if you can see it, you're going to be able to feel it even after paint. That probably didn't make much sense in hindsight. What I'm trying to say is, if you have a joint and you can feel that joint, like where the 1/2 inch and the 1/4 inch meet here, it's not going to disappear. Luckily, some wood filler will help smooth things out. Now you might be saying, that seems like a bit more work than I want to do if I had 20 doors to make. And guess what? You are absolutely right. It's a lot of work. No one said DIY was easy, and generally, the most basic version of DIY with the least amount of tools requires the most effort. Shocker. However, a major pro for this method is you can make these doors super cheap and save yourself a ton of money. If you're building these for a bathroom though, I might be a little hesitant to only use MDF because moisture is its weakness. Then again, the paint will seal it up. Another con is the overall durability of MDF. It's soft and dense and dings easily. If that concerns you because you have a gang of domestic terrorists running around your house like I do, I think you're going to like our next option. But that is a wrap for this one. Let's move on to door number 2. And if you're worried about how to actually paint and install the hinges, don't worry, I'll cover that at the end of the video for all 3 at the same time. All right, let's call this our intermediate version. And to build it, you're going to need a circular or a miter saw, either one doesn't matter, a router with a rabbiting bit, sander, a square, and then optionally something to drill in pocket holes. Again, emphasis on optional, don't panic just yet. As far as what to buy, get some 1/2 inch MDF and a 1x3, and all these materials are readily available at a home center. Just make sure to take a little time finding the flattest and straightest version of each, which is a bit of a treasure hunt sometimes. First step is going to be cutting these stiles to the height of the door. And just like with option 1, these are 1/2 inch overlays, so I added an inch to the height of the door opening. You've already seen me show how to make this exact cut on a circular saw, so don't panic if you're miter sawless. Simple crosscuts, people. Getting the rails to the correct size is as simple as positioning a stop block to the final width of the door, plus 1 inch for the overlay, and then placing 2 offcuts in between the stop and the blade to account for the stile width. All right, now we need to get our woodworking on and connect these 4 pieces together. As promised, pocket holes are going to be optional. To demonstrate what I'm talking about, I'm going to, optionally, drill pocket holes in only one of the 2 rail pieces. Also, you don't need a tricked out pocket hole jig like this one. The basic version gets the job done all the same, just a little slower. All right, time to put this all together, and it's pretty straightforward and easy. On one side, we'll be using the glue and screw, and then on the other side, it's going to be glue only. Although that's pretty confusing now that I say it out loud. Let me explain, hold on a second. A joint with screws and glue like this one is really strong. You're not breaking it in normal door use. Also, be sure to clamp the board to a bench. They wiggle while sinking in pocket screws. As I was saying, this is beefy, like high quality Angus stuff here. On the opposing side, with an end grain to edge grain joint using glue only, it's strongish, but beefy is not how I would describe it. More like beyond beef. However, once we take care of the back panel, our weak vegan joint will be super jacked. So I'm gonna let this dry for an hour or so and then we can keep going. Time for this door to take some anabolic steroids in the form of a 1/2 inch rabbiting bit. Now that I have this properly installed in my router, I'm setting the depth so we're taking about 1/8 of an inch pass. Always take shallow passes with your router. If you risk it and try to hog away all the material in 1 or 2 passes, you're gonna have a bad time. If it's your first time here, welcome. I hope that you're learning something new, and if you are, I would greatly appreciate it if you at the very least hit the like button. If you want to make my day extra special, subscribing would be even better. If it's not your first time here and you still haven't done those things, come on, what are you waiting for? But kidding aside, thanks to everyone for just watching. All right, I've made 3 passes. I am going to take a 4th to get to my final depth. I'm using this scrap piece of 1/2 inch MDF to set the bit to the proper height so that the back panel will sit flush with the rails and stiles. You can also see why I drilled my pocket holes far away from the inside edge. Now, I never claimed that this version of doors was the fastest to make, and I'll cover the pros and cons in a moment, but the nice thing is, unlike our beginner door, you get a little more oomph with wood rails and stiles instead of MDF. Even though this wood is borderline vegan, it's better than sawdust. A quick measurement of this rabbet, and then I can cut the 1/2 inch sheet of MDF to size for this panel. You might be asking if a 1/4 inch MDF would be okay for the back panel. Short answer, yes. Long answer, I don't personally love the look of the 1/4 inch being inset so far back from the front of the rails and stiles. It looks cheap to me. Plus, it's nice having a door with a little more heft and gravitas. Unfortunately, we're now at an impasse, and it's a tale as old as time. The square panel in the round rabbet situation. And one of these has to give, so you can either chisel off these corners and make this 90 degrees, or you can round off your panel corners to match the radius of the rabbet. It's up to you. There's no right or wrong answer. As for me, I'm a simple man and like the path of least resistance, so I'm just gonna nip the bulk off with the circular saw and then round these with a random orbital sander. But again, this is all personal preference. If you're making a drawer face instead of a door, it's likely the back will never even be seen, so keep that in mind. Putting a bow on our pocket holes versus no pocket holes conversation, by gluing this panel into place along the inside of our rabbet, most importantly on that corner where the rails and stiles meet, this joint now has a spline reinforcing it. And without getting too technical with the woodworking mumbo jumbo, that turns beyond beef into super jacked Angus, plus some. So if you'd like an insurance policy, by all means, add screws. If not, you will be fine as is. I know a lot of people take pride in creating something that will last 200 years. Quite honestly, once I'm dead, I don't really care, and it's likely these will be in a landfill in 20 years anyways when my wife has me redo them. It shouldn't take much other than tape to hold this panel in place here. Mine's pretty snug. It's a good idea to double check that you had no glue squeeze out on the front. I was sure to make sure to keep the glue on the inside part of the rabbet, not the outside part, but this looks good. While this dries, I'm going to fill in the pocket holes, then hit the joint between the back panel and the rails and stiles with some wood fillers, and this is pretty close to good to go. Also, if you're completely new to woodworking and this all sounds fun and exciting, I recently released a course with a couple buddies called The Best Beginner Woodworking Course, period. And it's everything we wish we had starting out, so check out the link below if this interests you. Some quick pros and cons for our intermediate door. On the plus side, you don't need any fancy equipment, and no, a router is pretty basic, people. These are reasonably cheap to make, plus wood rails and styles will offer a little more durability. But on the cons, they aren't the fastest door to make, and if you want to impress the dishes in your cabinet, you will need to spend a little time on the rabbet in the back panel if it doesn't suit your fancy as is. But speaking of fancy, we're going to make something really professional looking for door number 3. Time to do it. I hope most of you are picking up on the underlying theme of this video, and that is, like most things in woodworking, there are always multiple ways to get things done. Speaking of, to build our advanced door, you're going to need a table saw, sander, and some clamps. You can buy 3/4 inch hardwood like this poplar from home centers or a specialty lumber dealer, and then rip it down to the appropriate size for your rails and stiles. As far as what wood you want to use, like I said, I'm using poplar because it's cheap and it paints like a dream. However, it's not terribly durable. If the running of the bulls is a daily occurrence in your house, pay a bit more and upgrade to maple. Now this is all paint grade advice, by the way. Figuring out your stile height is the exact same, just the height of the door, and don't forget to account for the overlay on the top and the bottom. Now as for the rails, there is a bit more math involved, so I'm going to make my 3rd grade teacher proud and show you my work on screen. My finished door width is 16 inches, but just like the first 2 doors, I need to subtract 2 times the stile width. 16 minus 4 equals 12. However, this time we need to add back 1 inch to account for our groove depth. And that brings our final width to 13 inches. Told you I could do it, Miss Marchetti. I've talked about this in other videos, however, I've recently decided it's a hill I'm willing to die on, and I know I'm speaking to the lowest common denominator here, so maybe that makes me the idiot. Nonetheless, if you're watching this and you have aspirations of building your own doors or making other furniture, you need tools for that. So don't come to a video with the expectation that I or other creators are going to show you how to make something with just hopes and dreams. It doesn't work like that. If you're tight on cash like I was starting out, buy used. Contrary to what dummies post in the comment section, you do not need $20,000 worth of tools to do this. And I think I've shown throughout this video that you can do a lot with very little. I have the parts cut to size for my rails and stiles. Now, if you are making multiple doors at the same time, please label everything so you don't lose track. I do need to cut a groove in all 4 of these parts, so let me show you how easy that is to set everything up. For starters, I'm using a flat top blade. Flat tops leave a nice flat bottom, not to be confused with the fat bottom for all the Queen fans out there, versus the W shape from an ATB, and we do not want that. Now I can set the blade height to 1/2 inch using my combination square. This is made by PEC, by the way. I always get questions when I show it. They're made in the USA and super high quality. I have a link below. Next, position the fence so that the center of the blade is as close as you can get it to the center of your rail and stile. It doesn't need to be bang on, just get it as close as you can. Now all the parts can be run through the table saw. I do like to verify that the groove is actually 1/2 inch deep on my test piece first. And as you're doing this, it's important to apply pressure down and against the fence simultaneously. A featherboard can help, but it's not a requirement. Just go slow, and if you're batching out a lot of parts, don't lose focus because that's when accidents happen. All right, an initial cut has been made on all of our parts, plus the test piece. Now we can just position the fence so that the groove will end up the perfect width to accept the center panel. Just barely bump the fence towards the blade and take a pass using the test piece. But you need to flip the board around 180 degrees and run it through again. And this will perfectly center the groove on the piece. This looks to be just barely too wide right now, so I'm going to have to make one more adjustment, tapping the fence over. And remember, any adjustment you make is effectively doubled because you're cutting the board twice, so keep that in mind when you're making your adjustments. Fine tune it, as they say. I think you can see why having a test piece is so important. If I had moved that fence over too much and the groove became too wide, it wouldn't ruin an actual part. Now, as far as the fit, you don't want anything too tight, especially MDF, because it will swell when glue is applied, but don't get it too loose either and have this floppy panel. Bit of a Goldilocks and the Three Bears situation. My test piece looks just about perfect, so I'm going to run all the parts through and making sure to do a flip on each one. And I'm sure that people are asking if it's okay to use plywood instead of MDF for the center panel, and I'll cover that after this next step because that is a fair question. Excellent news, we now have rails and stiles and a test piece with a perfectly centered groove. However, we do need a way to connect these together, and the easiest way to do that is with a tenon tongue thing. I'm actually not sure if it's called a tenon or a tongue in this situation. Someone let me know down below. First things first, lower the blade height to just a smidgen below the height of the groove. And remember, a smidgen is a very standardized measurement. Then use a combination square to set the fence so the outside of your blade, not the inside, matches the depth of your groove. Mine is a 1/2 inch. All right, so that's all set, and now we can make some test cuts. I do have a miter gauge with a scrap piece of wood to support the workpiece and reduce tear out. So I'm starting on the edge and then working my way over until I make contact with the fence. And since this is not a through cut, you're okay using the fence with a miter gauge here. If this were a through cut, it's a big no-no. Don't do it. Once you have one side done, you can flip it over and then repeat the same steps. You might notice me moving the piece across the blade. Again, another thing that looks unsafe, but it's okay. And this motion will get your tenon piece all JB smooth on both sides. If your tenon piece does not fit in the groove after the first try, and it shouldn't because you were precisely a smidgen too low, barely raise the blade and shave everything off on both sides. Unfortunately, there is no mathematical formula for determining the numerical difference between a smidgen and a barely, so that one's up to you. All right, time for a fit check. You're looking for something not too tight, not too loose. Friction fit is all you need. That's pretty good right there. And some troubleshooting tips here. If you're putting this in and the tenon is too short and you're not bottoming it all the way out in the groove, that means your tenon is not long enough. So move the fence away. And if you're having the opposite problem, move your fence a little bit closer. Now that everything's dialed in, I'm going to cut the tenons on my actual style pieces. And while I do that, it's the perfect opportunity to anticipate some of the not so bright comments this video will get. Yes, I am fully aware that they make router bits that replicate the same results faster. However, my channel has now received over 50,000 comments, and I've read every single one of them. And from those comments, I know the beginners in my audience are much more likely to have a table saw before a router table. So I felt it would be helpful to show them how to get it done like this. And if you have a problem with that, I refer you back to this earlier timestamp in the video. I have my rails and stiles ready to go, which means I can temporarily put this together and then measure the dimension for my inner panel. But remember, you need to show your work to get full credit with Miss Marchetti. This door has an interior height of 16 3/8 and a width of 12 1/16. However, we don't want that panel to be perfectly snug, so let's subtract 1/8 of an inch in both directions, and that'll give us some wiggle room while we're assembling everything together. Now it's as simple as cutting your panel material to size. As promised, let's talk about plywood versus MDF. If you're painting the doors, go for MDF all the way. It's nice and stable, plus it paints much better than the plywood. If it's a stain grade door, use plywood that matches the species of your rails and stiles. Keeping the elementary school theme going, time for a little show and tell. When I insert this 1/4 inch panel into the groove, you'll notice that there is a 1/4 inch reveal on the rails and stiles on both the front and the back. Now, if you're doing a door, that's perfectly acceptable. In fact, that's very standard. However, if this were a drawer face, you'd want the back panel to be even with the rails and stiles, and that would allow it to sit perfectly flush on the face of the drawer front box, just like you had with our first two doors in the beginner and the intermediate. But we need a 1/2 inch center panel to do that. I cut this to size earlier with the 1/4 inch panel, and obviously the 1/2 inch is not going to fit the groove that we have, which means this needs a rabbet along all 4 sides. Now, typically this is done with a dado stack, but in the interest of keeping this basic, let's use a standard table saw blade. I'm setting the height to just barely less than 1/2 inch, and if you're not comfortable with running this through the table saw on edge, adding an auxiliary high fence like this will make the cut much more stable. And just like when we use the fence with the miter gauge, this is a non-through cut, so the risk is pretty low in terms of things going wrong. Just keep it nice and stable with both hands and go slow. Also, credit where credit is due. I saw Senor Stumpy show how to make this cut years ago. And just like cutting the groove in the rails and stiles, this is going to take multiple passes, just barely bumping the fence towards the blade until you have a 1/4 inch rabbet. Again, much faster with a dado stack or a router table, and I'm aware that those tools exist, but this is all about showing different ways to get something done. For the assembly, I'm going to be demonstrating on a 1/4 inch panel. Now, if you want to use the 1/2 inch with the rabbet, it is the exact same thing. But as of 10 seconds ago, I decided that there are 100% more doors than drawers in the world. What do you think? It's a good new debate, huh? More doors or drawers? It's got to be more doors. While you sit there mulling that over, let me fill you in on another great woodworking debate, and that is to glue in the center panel or let it float. Unfortunately, logic is often thrown out the window and the internet overcomplicates something simple, but it's as easy as this. If you're using a solid wood center panel, let it float and only apply glue to the tenons. And the reason is this: solid wood panels need room to expand and contract. When you glue them in, that doesn't allow it to happen and it's eventually going to crack. For plywood and MDF center panels, glue the entire thing into place because they don't change seasonally like a solid wood and don't need room to expand and contract. And also, you don't need to panic because the solid wood rails and stiles can still expand outward when the center panel is glued in, and since they're such narrow pieces, they aren't going to be moving much anyways. Some quick pros and cons. If you're batching out a lot of doors, this is reasonably fast, and it's a sturdy way to make doors that will be resilient thanks to the hardwood rails and stiles. On the con side, they require some fussing during setup, and you do need a table saw unlike the first two options. Some people like to wait until after painting to drill out their hinge locations. I prefer to do it before. That's because if anything catastrophic happens, you don't waste all the time painting something that needs to be fixed. I've shown this jig whenever I do doors, but it's a solid 10 out of 10 if you plan on using Euro-style hinges with any regularity. I'm someone that likes to do a test install with all the doors, drawer faces, and hardware before the final prep. It's not mandatory, but I would highly consider doing it if these are your first cabinets. Everything in my laundry room is an overlay style door, meaning they rest on the outside of the face frames, as opposed to the inset like this drawer face on my shop cabinet, which is flush with the face frame. So then the question you might be asking, inset or overlay, which is better? Now, when it comes to aesthetics, that's purely personal preference. But in terms of the building and the actual install, overlay style doors are much more forgiving. And if you're a beginner, that's where I would start because they can cover up things that might be slightly out of square. Inset doors and drawers, on the other hand, those things are just cruel. This reveal needs to be consistent all the way around. So a lot of things need to be pretty bang on square. And if you accidentally cut something too short, like I did on the width here, your reveal is going to be inconsistent. Now, thankfully, this is a piece of shop furniture, so it really doesn't matter. But if this was an actual nice piece of furniture, I would have needed to remake that drawer front. So start with the overlay, and then you can tackle inset afterwards. Now, this is going to stay exactly as is, but my laundry room cabinets, doors, and drawers, those need some paint. Slight change of plans. I was going to give you some tips and tricks on painting these doors, but then I thought, what the hell am I going to teach you about painting? I suck at it. So much so that I normally contract this out. Instead, here's a Clip Notes version of the steps that I took. Before painting, I used wood filler on any joints and sanded using 180 grit. Thankfully, the weather was cooperating and I didn't need to turn the garage into a scene from Dexter like I did a couple weeks ago. I put one coat of water-based primer on everything. Actually, hold on, that's not right. I put 2 coats of primer on the MDF edges, 1 coat on everything else. Now, I bought this sprayer specifically for this project. In my official review, it doesn't seem professional quality, but it's more than good enough for DIY. And then I sanded and caulked the inside joint. And yes, you can caulk, the panel isn't moving. And finally, I sprayed 2 coats of this Sherwin-Williams Emerald Urethane Trim Enamel, making sure to sand in between coats. If you want actual painting tips, please watch Actual Painting Pros, not this dummy. But I will say the end results were not too shabby. Also, here's a great example of why I like caulking the inside joint. Same door, I only did the front, did not do the back, and you can see pretty significant difference between the two with the final look. So there you go, plenty of options to help you build shop cabinets or a custom space like my laundry room. Did that project take me almost a year to finally finish? Maybe, but I did save a lot of money, and now you have everything that you need to do the same. I really hope this one helped. If you're looking for another fun project after you get your cabinets done, check out this video on how to build some floating shelves. We'll see ya.